Hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 2 of the OMNIA Performance Podcast. Today we are going to be discussing why you should do an ultramarathon. Pretty simple. There we go. Podcast is over. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Goodbye.
No, today we are going to break that down as to why we believe there is so much value to be had from ultramarathons. Almost went full lisp there. Ultramarathons. In terms of physiological, psychological, and the physical benefits that come from them. It's much more than just a training goal, a distance. There is a whole journey that we all go on, and that is why we sadistically love it so much. So what we're going to do is run through our background in ultramarathons and ultras in general, run through why a big, hairy, scary, obnoxious goal is a good thing to set and not something that we should put ourselves under too much pressure to not set, I think is a terribly worded way of saying you shouldn't put yourself off giving something a go. Why the training process and journey is infinitely more valuable than the end goal itself, the lessons that will be learnt along the way from a physical, a personal, and a social point of view, why time alone in this modern era is so rare, so why ultramarathoning becomes so valuable in that sense, and the event itself, and then we will conclude. I'm Fergus Crawley, and this is
Jonny Payne.
And we are going to break things down for you today. So if you haven't yet done so, please do make sure to hit the follow/subscribe button depending on which platform you are listening on. Do make sure to share.
Could be here.
Yeah.
Could be there.
It could be up, down. Well, actually, if you're on YouTube, it's below you. If you're on Spotify, it's at the top. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, it's at the top as well. If you're listening on another podcast platform, then you take podcasting very seriously, and I don't have the expertise to make a recommendation, I am afraid. So, Jonny, first up, break down your background in ultras for us, please.
Well, to break down my background in ultras means we have to break down all the breakdowns, doesn't it? So
break down your body physically, yes.
Yeah. Which injury should we start with? I think that's probably key, isn't it? I've been running, shall we say, ultramarathons probably over a decade, 15 years maybe. Ran many, how do we put it, organised, I suppose, ultramarathons, sort of, and many really just in training and just in practice. So I guess 10, 15 years I've been doing them. We've covered off a lot of the big ones, but I guess probably come back to it. I've hit quite a few roadblocks with injuries. I guess part of the reason why we enjoy coaching from that perspective, ultramarathons, is because we've kind of, between the two of us, been through enough to know what the pitfalls are. And through the pitfalls and kind of hitting those lows and kind of suffering through injury and things, it's easier to help others avoid them. And it also brings out some of the joy in it, because actually achieving some of those things after having failed, so to speak, is pretty awesome. So I've done ultramarathons of note, I suppose, are the Arc of Attrition, which I didn't finish. As a 100-mile ultramarathon around the coast of Cornwall, a very, very tough winter ultramarathon. The Spine Race, which I didn't finish, which is a 300 odd mile, we probably should clarify that with some notes somewhere, but 300 odd mile ultramarathon, one of the toughest in the world across the Pennine Way. Again, we'll come back to why I didn't finish these and what I learned from that. Many ultramarathons, it seems a strange thing to say, but many ultramarathons when I look at it in training, because training for a kind of a 300 mile ultramarathon meant I was doing 50-mile stints every 2 weeks, maybe, out through the dark and all the rest of it. So I guess outside of those organised ones, I know I've ran over 50 miles many, many times. So it's something that I bizarrely enjoy, and something that, even because I haven't done it for a little while, because of, guess what, injury, I genuinely miss it. So I'm looking forward to doing, I think the event in September does qualify as an ultramarathon, in actual fact, so more coming. But many, I can't list the number, but many ultramarathons under my belt and in my knees.
And I think the main thing to acknowledge there is that a lot of them have been done in training, and there are some subcategories, some subgroups out there in the running world that might think, well, that doesn't count because it wasn't an event. But
it counts.
Yeah. I found a lot more from the self-supported ones, because there's a whole process, journey, planning, logistics. How am I going to make it work? How am I going to make sure my head torch is charged through the night? A whole load of other stuff that goes on that makes it a much more introspective experience. And that's where I've really found a love, a word I use tentatively for them. But from my background, my first ultra was in training in preparation for a 94 miler, which I then ran 6 miles at the end and made 100. But the first time I saw 30 miles in my Training Peaks calendar, I inherently started to panic a little bit because it was such a big, hairy, scary number. And we'll come on to why setting a goal, getting some skin in the game is really important. But seeing it there in the calendar as part of training, which is horrifying for me, even though logic said through the training I've been doing, building up and up and up to that point, it was something that I had in me. So when Mr. Payne here brought the pain, as it were, and put it in that Training Peaks calendar for me in September, October 2019.
I want to say 19.
It would have been, yeah. And I went out for my first 30 miler, got through it, and it was an absolute breeze. And that's not something I'm saying in any sort of blowing my own whistle ways and I'm genetically gifted. It was a lot of work had gone into it to prepare me for that point. Yeah. But the pressure of seeing it there as, an ultra, made me doubt myself, made me question myself. So when I came out the other side, what a valuable training session. Way more than just 30 miles on my feet. It was such a, oh, wow, you've actually achieved something by accident that you once thought unfathomable. And that was where the sort of real fascination with them came. And then I saw 10 p.m. start from Glasgow to run 54 miles through to Edinburgh. And suddenly my love for ultras was quickly warped from within me. And I thought, how on earth am I going to do this? And I was sitting on the train from Glasgow to Edinburgh, which for anyone that doesn't know is about 45 minutes. On a Friday night, I had about 9 kilos worth of pack weight in terms of water, electrolytes, carbs, squares, bars.
Too much.
Layers, too much, yeah. I didn't want to bonk, though. I didn't want to bonk. This is the thing. The fear that went into it meant I was massively overprepared. So I was sitting next to some students drinking Pimm's in a can, and I just had this internal urge to just tell somebody. I was like, I'm running back. Somebody please tell me somebody tell me this isn't a horrible idea. The thought of this sitting alongside students getting on the piss to get a train to a destination where the sole intention was for me to get back on foot was just such a surreal experience.
I'll tell you what, before you go any further then, one of the, when we're looking at what's the background in ultras, why were you doing that? So I know why you were doing that. Perhaps people watching this, but it's worth saying what brought you to your first ultra, because on paper, if we consider an ultra anything really above a marathon, 26.2 miles and above, I think a lot of people will mark it off as being 30 miles and above. There's I can't be arsed, I'm sure you can't be, to get into that kind of pointlessly granulated argument. But there has been some point in your training career or your athletic career where you said either, and it may be one of the two, might be both, either I want to do an ultramarathon, I feel like I need to do an ultramarathon, or I'm going to do an ultramarathon because. So give us a little bit of kind of context there as to why on earth were you on the train in the first place?
So I was chronologically working through that without the context, which retrospectively probably wasn't the right way to go. So thank you for bringing me back there. So I was training at the time for what was called Mega Movember, which was my 3 charity fundraising events within the month for Movember. So on the 1st of 2019, 1st of November, that is 2019, I lunged 6,890 metres to represent the 6,890 suicides in the UK and Republic of Ireland the year before. On the 17th of that month, I organised a 13-hour, 13-man workout at WIT in London to represent the 13 men that die by suicide each day in the UK, with the overarching message being that no man is left behind. So we were all there to support each other and get each other through a long, grueling day. Managed to raise just over £15,000 that day, which was mega. So big shout out to the boys that helped push us through it there. And then the 29th and 30th was a 94-mile run from Loch Lomond to Edinburgh to represent 94 male suicides a week. And at that point, the furthest I had ran was, I think, 18 miles. So my first ultra that I'd committed to was 94 miler, and I did always have the intention in the back of my mind, if I'd made it that far, whilst the number was significant, I did want to hit the 100 miler mark, because I feel like it's a bit of a one and done sort of thing, or at least I thought it was. I do have sights on 100 miles in the future, but back then I thought, if I'm going to do this, I might as well tick a few boxes off as I go. So this was part of the training. So I was on the train to Glasgow to run back to Edinburgh as part of my training, and that was going to be my longest training run. So 54 miles along the Union Canal, and Johnny's brief was actually pretty thin, and that was intentional because he wanted me to really, really suffer psychologically and know what it felt like to go through the graveyard shift ahead of time, because it would make the graveyard shift on the 94 miler overnight that much easier because I'd already lived through it once. Yeah. So to break it down, I set off really quite well, got to 20 odd miles, but started to feel a little bit of weight in my trap, started to sort of feel like I was working a little bit harder than I was. My pace felt like it was a higher heart rate than it should have been. And here's a good lesson. You can apply all the logic in the world. I've got a lot of experience in this now, but there's still little things that you often forget. So just because I was self-supported meant that I knew I had to carry all of my supplies with me, but I didn't then account for the fact that that meant that my pack weight was going to be 8-9 kilos. So I was actually running with a significant amount of weight. So no wonder my traps were feeling beaten up. No wonder the effort was feeling harder. So then immediately I got into a negative headspace at 25 miles. This is 25 miles. This shouldn't feel this hard. You did the 30 miler 4 weeks ago. Why is it feeling this hard? You've obviously prepared badly, you idiot. God, it's 1 a.m. What's going on? And then that sort of flapping that goes on.
It's interesting psychological training, if you like, from my perspective. Also, from a selfish perspective, from a coaching perspective, get into the weeds, it meant that I was buying tools back for the actual supported run, because we knew that on the supported run you would do 94 miles with less weight. We knew you would do it with more support. We knew that the food that you got, if you remember back on that unsupported 94 miles, you passed a went, it froze in the night and you couldn't eat things properly. So even the food you were carrying,
that, but I just have done,
even the food you were carrying became kind of somewhat redundant. It was just weight. So I knew that when you did the run, you'd have an opportunity to stop off and sit and have your food kind of given to you. You'd be supported in that way. You'd be carrying a hell of a lot less. And that there would be tools for me. If you remember, I was able to say to you quite easily, do you remember how bad you felt 2 weeks ago, or however long back, I can't remember how long between the two efforts it was, not long. Remember how bad you felt at this point? It isn't actually as bad now. Do you remember how bad your traps were? They're not as bad now. So we're able to kind of have this comparison and reflection model that was built out of the fact that we'd sent you out there with an unnecessary amount of hassle,
additional stuff to deal with.
So then when you came to do it, it's that old easy trite adage, which is work hard and or suffer in training so you don't have to at the event, which we couldn't take away the suffering, but we could take away some of the psychological suffering, which was an interesting course of action.
Preparation is key. There's cliche number 1 of the day. It might be number 2. I'm
number 15.
Yeah, well, that's the first one that I flagged anyway. So
not to be cliched.
Plenty more to come, don't you worry. But I'm aware that we're sort of focusing on this one event a little bit more than we probably should for the rest of the actual discussion here. But I think that was the real pivotal moment for me where I learned the value to be gained from ultras, because it was about 3:30 in the morning. I was between Falkirk and Linlithgow, and I actually took out my phone to phone a taxi because I just had a bit of a verbal altercation with some of the travelling community I'd sat down outside basically a camp without realising, and then some drunken attendants came around the corner to ask what on earth I was doing. And as I very strangely at 3 a.m. explained to them, look at the kit I'm in, I'm running from Glasgow to Edinburgh, they obviously didn't believe me, but the confusion time that bought me allowed me to shuffle off at about 12-minute mile pace with a lot of weight on my back. And then I was just in a bit of a hole psychologically. I picked up the phone to a taxi. I got up to the point on the iPhone where you hit like the number on Google, and then it pops up with the option of call or cancel. And I hovered and then hit cancel and thought, what are you doing, Fergus? And that is the moment for me that I really refer to as the real win, that made me realise actually that every little hurdle like that I cross on this journey of ultra running, journey of ultra endurance, is going to make me a better person. It's going to better prepare me for the next time something goes wrong. It's going to better prepare me for the next ultra. And it meant that when I was smugly having a McMuffin in McDonald's at 8:30 in the morning, the following morning telling Jonny I actually did it, and he said, "Oh, I didn't expect you to actually get through all of that with the additional pack weight." I sort of chuckled my way all the way home to the bank and then fell asleep.
We got some failure, but not ultimately. The whole thing was a success. So it's an interesting one.
So from a program point of view, the intention was for me to do. The intention was basically get to a physiological point of demand where psychologically I was really learning the lessons that I needed to learn. But you didn't expect me to get the whole way without having to can it in some way.
Yeah, I thought we were going to get a phone. I was on alert to get a phone call at some point. Come help.
And that's a sadistic way that we like to build resilience training into our programming for anyone interested.
Being an utter wanker didn't work for me, did it?
Anyway, that is a long drawn out background. Since then, I've done over 26.2 miles about 17 times. Some have been at a set pace, some have been at an easy pace, some have been in the mountains, some have been with the lifting in the same day, some have been on the bike. I've sat on a turbo trainer for 30 hours, for example. So I have a lot of familiarity with, in the past couple of years, of what it is like to be in that ultra endurance hole, whether it's outdoors, indoors, in harsh environments, in nice environments. It's almost akin to what I think the Western California psychedelic community is starting to explore, in the sense that they get to an otherworldly state of being where they can only reflect upon themselves in a certain way once they get there. And I'm not saying that ultra running is psychedelic, but I'm saying that it's another pathway to get to a place that you can't get to unless you go on that pathway, if you know what I mean.
I 100% agree with it. It's an interesting way to put it, actually. There's been... So my experience, going back to that question with ultramarathons, why would you do such a thing, was because it seemed like an enormous task, and it seemed like something that possibly I couldn't do. So you look at something like a 100-mile ultramarathon. The first organised ultramarathon I did, not similar to you actually, was 100 miles, and it was brutal, and it seemed an impossible task. So anybody who knows my personality knows that would then be something I'd want to try. And I'm more familiar now, perhaps wasn't at the time, but I'm certainly more familiar now with the idea, and this doesn't stop me trying, in actual fact. You would think it might, but certainly more familiar with the idea that failing's okay during these things. And that's an interesting, which is again why I set, because this came after my events obviously, why I set you the opportunity to fail, and really kind of, it wasn't a loss from a coaching perspective, but to have you fail would have been very interesting, because the question would have been, how did it feel? And what did you do with that emotion? And what did you do when you hit a point where you had failed, and all that kind of stuff? And having been there myself, I know that actually it lends itself hugely to, well, without getting too over the top about it, your kind of life philosophy, which is something we want to dive into to a degree. On the Arc of Attrition, for instance, I got 4 miles in. That was a 100-mile ultramarathon. 4 miles into that and broke my leg, as you know. Anybody watching, well, that was done then at 4 miles, but it wasn't. We had a plan B set in place, myself and a psychology coach that I had worked with a little bit, in the sense that, okay, what would go wrong? And this is probably useful for people actually looking at these kind of big events. You need to make a list of things that may go wrong, and what would you do if they did go wrong? What's the worst case scenario? What's a small thing that can go wrong? Like, I run out of water, what would I do? I run out of this, what would I do? I go off track, what would I do? And we had it nailed right down to, what if you suffer some kind of almost catastrophic injury? What do you do? And the answer in the notes that I'd practiced was assess and review, see how bad it is, see how bad the situation is, and then assess and review periodically and make decisions as you go, rather than this large catastrophic, oh shit, it's all gone bad, what do we do now? Right, let's just bin it. So I broke my leg, which perhaps retrospectively should have been a good reason to stop the race, but carried on nonetheless. My brother was actually running support for me in that one. I told him, I think it was a mile 12 was the first break point where you could be thrown a sandwich or something like that. Unsupported, but people could come and clap at you, and obviously threw bananas when they shouldn't be, into just a melee on the floor. It was quite interesting. And I said, I think I've broken my leg. And obviously we had a bit of a fight in the corner about how he thought I should then stop, and I was saying no, and had to argue with him not to tell anybody. And so the rest of my time was worrying not only about my leg, but about being dobbed in. So I continued. But knocked on, yeah. What I found was that if I ran, and this is by no means ideal, and I wouldn't want anybody to repeat this, but if I ran in a certain manner, or if I really managed it very, very carefully, if I managed my gait perfectly, the pain was less than if I was kind of running a little bit loose. So essentially I could carry on. I knew it was broken, I could feel it was broken, but I could carry on. So I did. And I carried on till, I think it was mile 94, 96, when I was slow enough for the sweeper at the back of the race to say, you're done, mate. You know, I was far too slow by that point. But what was interesting for me in that particular race or event, it's probably strange for me to call that a race, being that I was just trying to survive, is that from mile 4 to mile 90, whatever it was, I then had a very different mindset to anything that I'd ever entered into anything before with. And it wasn't survival, that would be ridiculous, because it was completely voluntary at any time I could have stopped. But it became, what can I do? How much can I continue? Is it worth continuing? What's the payoff here? Am I going to continue to make this injury worse? Is it going to be sort of overall a very catastrophic choice, blah, blah, blah. And so that became an interesting lesson for me in how to manage those kind of thoughts and those kind of very, very negative thoughts. And ultimately, although I didn't get to the end and get the buckle that was the prize at the end of that particular race, I felt like I got a huge amount out of it, plus a set of crutches. Which
is hard to come by, to be fair. Yeah, hard to come by these days. So I think that probably moves quite neatly into the journey and the process review in terms of the training for all these things. It's antisocial. there are sacrifices required in terms of the time commitment, in terms of the physical integrity commitment. Injury risk is somewhat higher due to volume, but a lot of the way that we program is actually trying to be a little bit more clever around just relying on weekly mileage and weekly volume as the key principal metric, because that is often where runners will tend to find themselves getting injured because they don't necessarily have the strength base to underpin that, which then means that stress fractures, integrity sort of falls down because overall robustness is not underpinned by that strength base. So from a program point of view, from an OMNIA point of view, we like to be a little bit more creative in terms of how we get people to the end goal that isn't just weekly mileage and volume. And a question we often get is, oh, how many miles would you have me running if we were going to do this? And we don't have a clear answer because it depends on the individual context of the person. And our principal dominant metric is not just mileage ran. There are a few things that we'd sort of work in as sort of test metrics, test periods. Like a really good metric for a 100 miler is, can you run back-to-back marathons Saturday, Sunday, or date? It doesn't need to be Saturday, Sunday. Could be a Monday, Tuesday if you want it to be. Could be a Wednesday, Thursday. Back-to-back marathons day to day means that you're in a pretty good position for a 100 miler. That's something we tend to work in with clients, athletes that are looking to do that. If you ever decide to work with us in a one-to-one capacity.
Yeah. I mean, going back to your metrics and the way that we were describing the how we manage it, and if we go back to our experiences, those are kind of experiences we've chosen to talk about, and we could talk for quite some time about quote unquote fun that we've had on ultramarathons or things. I
think flipping on its head is how much did you gain from the process and the journey of getting to that point that meant that you became quite stoical about the fact, right, I'm 4 miles in with a broken leg, why is it worth me carrying on?
Yeah, that in of itself is an interesting discussion that I think that made me want to do more ultramarathons, because I did have some very, very deep internal discussions that actually were some of them were quite joyful over that time frame. I found that there was much more in me in terms of pushing. Up to that point, I had just been going for a very, very, very long run in some quite difficult terrain, and there was a lot of gradient in that particular race. But I knew what it was. Now dragging around a busted leg is a very different prospect. Now you get to see the grit that you might or might not have ever found. So it's a bit of a gift, really, I think, in a very strange sense. But we don't need, going back to you talking about the metrics and things, we don't need to have people run ultramarathon. One thing that I'd done wrong, I think, in prep for that, and we're going back quite some time when I ran that particular race, it was running too much. I'd been running too much. I'd also become a little bit self-obsessed, perhaps is the wrong word, but certainly very far too tuned in to the idea of being as light as I could for that particular race. I maintained my strength, as I've always managed to do, but got lighter and lighter and ran far too much. So these are the reasons the methodology that we have now was kind of born out of these mistakes. It's like, well, did I need to run that far? Did I need to run almost an ultramarathon, 60, 70 miles in prep for a 100 miler? Probably not. I needed to know that I had the aerobic capacity to meet that end demand, and I needed to know that I had the physical integrity to cope with the assault on the body that 100 miles is.
The psychological integrity, which only comes from exposure, and that's where a lot of people might get it wrong in their first ultra, whether it's a 50 mile or a 100k or whatever it might be. If you have not battled through those battles already, then you are much more likely to fail when you are punched in the face.
There's loads of things
by the proverbial ultra.
Yeah. There's loads of things that we talked about that in previous podcasts and on the Modern Mind podcast. If you'd like to go there and have a look,
you should. Thank you. At the end of this episode, though, of course.
in terms of things that I could rely on, things that I might understand about myself. Like, I've been through X, so I know I can get through this, etc. But what it gives us, both the context that you described your own ultramarathon kind of birthing in, is this ability now to look at it experientially and say, actually, you can remove this particular part, or you can take this particular excess out, and you're still going to get the benefits from these particular inputs and probably manage. So we both know now that we don't need to run a massive amount. You still need to run. You need to put in the volume and get used to that, but you don't need to run ultramarathons. You need to just build yourself up to that volume and be strong enough. And so from our perspective, it's given us a professional understanding, I think, as well, which has been bloody useful, because then we can apply that to ourselves when we go back. So the whole thing, I think I'm banging on about, is it's a learning experience which allows us to give a little bit more as well.
I think I reflect on the discipline that came from knowing that for the next 12 to 18 weeks, however long it was, I can't remember, that incrementally my volume at the weekends was going to get bigger and bigger. Fatigue was going to accumulate higher and higher. because I was preparing for 3 events within the month of that list, still using that 94 miler as a that became 100 miler as a example. Fridays started at 1 kilometer, and then every Friday for the next however many Fridays, 500 meters additional bodyweight lunges. So it went from half an hour of lunging to 4.5 hours of lunging every Friday, where I was racing home from work to get to the gym on time to be able to lunge for long enough before the gym closed, which was just an absolutely absurd thing to even have to consider. And then the following day, on said tired legs, get out into the hills to complete X amount of time in zone 2, or get onto the road for X amount of time in zone 2. But we were quite careful in terms of what terrain I was on, so I could reach the same aerobic demand for less overall impact or less overall intensity demand, which was ultimately a real string in our bow and a real trick up our sleeve, and a trick up our sleeve for our athletes in terms of reaching the same end goal for less overall injury risk and demand in terms of just the tiredness that goes with this sort of thing. Because we want people to enjoy the process, we want people to learn lessons from it, and we want them to get to event day confident and happy, rather than this strange culture of sadism that goes on in the fitness industry where people think that you should turn up and just suffer through things. That's not why these events are there to be completed. They're there as a bit of a journey and a bit of a self-exploration, and we want that to begin from the day that people commit to them, sign up, get skin in the game, to the day that they finish them. And I think that leads quite nicely into some of the key lessons that we've learned along the way.
It does, because that's an interesting point you make, actually, is that it's really important to both of us, and we think we put this across to any athletes that come to us, and certainly we like to talk about it anyway ourselves, is that it's got to be fun. It really has to be fun. That needs underlined, I think, because we can, and what people are always interested in, and it's a funny one, isn't it, is like this idea of resilience, this idea of suffering that you've just talked about, this, how did you get through that? Tell us your war stories, tell us your horror stories and all the rest of it. And what people forget to ask is, was it fun? What was joyful about it? What was amazing about it? And it doesn't just have to be those kind of moments where you get an amazing scene. Going back to the ultras that we've both done, a lot of it's at night. You don't bloody see anything more than about 6 foot in front
Other
of
than
you.
that, a bubble of miserable head torch light.
A beam of light which kind of exists in a real...
It's a horrible place to be. Horrible place to be. So
there's not a lot to see outside in those particular windows, and you really are stuck inside your own mind. And some of that's beautiful, isn't it? Some of that can be scary, because especially the first time doing it, I remember talking to you about that. Okay, one thing that you're going to have to get used to that you won't have done before is running with this head torch on. And actually, it's not just what you would remember from using a torch either. You're caught in this strange little sort of very surreal bubble, which allows you nothing but your own footsteps and nothing but your own thoughts. And a lot of people are afraid of that. And I would say that probably I am still, I'm sure you are still, because there's a certain time frame you go through with that, and then everything kind of eases off and you kind of find yourself in this nice flow state, which people talk about in lots of sports. Yeah. And in that flow state, there's some beauty to be found, some joy, I think.
I think that the sort of applicable lesson there is that you become more comfortable in your own presence.
Yeah.
You're more comfortable being alone, which is something that we can take into our day-to-day management of our overall mental health as human beings, as our overall management of time demands, of productivity, in terms of if you just want to lock yourself away for a couple of hours in an office, you don't feel that human connection craving because you've got more comfortable in your own presence. We all have varying degrees of this as well, but ultras for me made me and has made me a lot more comfortable in my own presence. It's made my thoughts much more calibrated. And again, I've only come to those conclusions through having had the experience, which is why I think setting that big scary goal is so important, because once you've got skin in the game and you're accountable to something bigger than yourself, you can then start to work in how's it going to work, what am I going to learn, what changes I'm going to make, what sacrifices I'm going to make, and why just taking that first step is the first step of many. And even if that the next steps take a couple of years, just taking number one can be such a huge shift forwards for us as individuals.
It's interesting as well where you say about the this flow state, this meditative state, this kind of point where you find yourself alone with yourself and start to get to know yourself perhaps in a different way, or just get to be comfortable with that what is the loneliness of the long distance runner. It's kind of a nice place to be for times, and that's something we can't coach, but we like to hear about as well. It's like, well, what did you discover? What did you hear? People have, I know you have momentary eureka moments as well, because you just get a chance to kind of think about things that might have been on your mind. Not that people go out there and spend hours running trying to delve into their problems and things. It doesn't really work like that. But there are moments where you can go, oh, you know, and you can come off that big run and think, I'm going to change this. I've just had 2 hours really pondering this, and I don't know why I didn't see that before, you know. But it's down to the individual, you know. So coming back to your slightly odd analogy earlier on, perhaps about the these kind of psychedelic crusaders moving about and, you know, I don't know, running about on peyote or whatever. There are moments within these trips or journeys that they take in this, you know, strange psychological state where they discover certain things about themselves. I think there definitely is on the ultramarathons. I think there's moments there that, as you described earlier on, whether or not anybody wants to argue about psychedelia, I don't care. But there are moments in there that you find something that wasn't visible to you before. And there's great wonder in that. That's beautiful.
I have a folder in my phone which is not ultra thoughts but list thoughts, basically, where if I'm out on the bike or out running the Union Canal, I've got a lot from them, but because it's got clarity of thought, I've got sort of enough of a motor pattern going on so that I'm kind of focusing on my movement but not focusing on it enough to be completely focused on it. I'm kind of embracing my surroundings. I'm thinking about things without really thinking about things. Occasionally commercial ideas come to me, ideas on things I can do in the future, ideas on how I can do things better come to my mind, and then I find myself at the end of the run sitting there having finished, kind of just typing away on my phone, scribbling down all these ideas to then think about them once I'm in a more rational state of mind. And the eureka moment that you've described comes from doing that, and that comes from being away from my phones or being away from the white noise of the day-to-day world, getting out into new environments, new experiences, new sort of terrains is a great way of detaching yourself from the hustle and bustle of the day-to-day existence a lot of us listening or we live. So being able to put yourself in that sort of out of body, out of mind experience gives you a clarity that's hard to come by, and it doesn't require you to be 6 beers deep. It doesn't require you to be on peyote running around, as Johnny's just so aptly described, and it doesn't require you to be sort of in a real compromised state of being, unless you're running a really long way and you've broken your leg. But nonetheless, the training for it, the process, setting that goal, setting that accountability, and then working towards it is a journey that brings with it a lot of lessons for us as individuals, teaches a lot about ourselves, our personal, what's important to us personally, what's important to us socially, because it forces you to sacrifice certain things. Then you can actually assess what is giving me more from a fulfillment point of view, what can then drop moving forward. I know a lot of people have gotten to ultra running, Ironmans and things that decided, you know what, I actually am just going to go teetotal. Booze gives me nothing. I still drink because I enjoy the taste of alcohol, and it does get in the way of training, but I kind of work it in every once in a while. But I know people have decided, actually, I don't really like people. I'm just going to train on my own all the time. And there's nothing.
I'm now completely teetotal because of ultramarathon.
Yes, that is a claim we are making. But there's nothing wrong with either of those things. It's just a case of those people have only come to those realizations through going on the journey themselves. And I think that the key lessons I've learned from a physical point of view are just how much is available within the tank being myself. But that has only come through the work that's gone into it, and that's something that I'm proud of because it's grafted for. And that's a really nice thing to have because it's a currency that you can't trade on. It's a currency that isn't going to get drilled into with oil and suddenly become much more valuable. It's something it's sweat equity. And then when you actually sort of cash in on that, it's a really rewarding experience. From a social point of view, it's made me realize actually when to appreciate social situations, when to actually work in less sleep, when to work in booze, when to work in things, and what's more important to me around training. And then from a personal point of view, it's taught me a lot about myself, what's important to me, and I've had some eureka moments along the way that have been very valuable. And I think that's something that we can all find, but we need to take that first step, which is skin in the game, signing up to something or committing to something on a certain date at a certain time, getting a crew together, whatever it might be, and then working towards it. And I think that's the main thing, because the journey is much more important than the end goal itself. But speaking of the end goal itself, there is a lot to be learned from the actual day of said ultra. And I think plan A is going in confident and having learned the lessons that you need to learn in training. But then there are some certain considerations that you might have missed or that we should probably mention today, aren't there?
In terms of planning the event itself, in terms of making sure that people are safe, in terms of mapping it out, etc. When you've got an event booked, and you said skin in the game, and you book a specific event, then more often than not, unless it's one of the worst events we've heard of, you are going to have some kind of organizational structure there, which is a gift in of itself, because you can use that as a kind of a reverse engineer process. Some ultramarathons are going to allow you support. Some ultramarathons are going to allow you to bag drop and lay your own support out in advance. Some longer ultramarathon events are going to allow you to stop off every night at a camp, etc. So you need to know the detail there. And ultimately, as much as people quite like just to go out for the run and enjoy that, the further and further you get from point A on your journey to point B, the more planning you need to put in place, the more project planning, the more logistical planning, and the more, and this is not a sales pitch at all, but the more you certainly need to reach out to people who have done this stuff before and can say, aha, now I can tell you for a fact that although this seems to make sense, this doesn't work. What works is X, Y, and Z. So, read, talk to people, understand that, but plan it out, run through that plan, run through the plan again, run it by somebody, and then practice it. Those kind of things are vital. And again, going back to the many, many mistakes I've made over the years, some of it's just been pure bravado. Well, I'll just be able to go X amount of miles. I'll carry the water. I've got enough food.
Well, good mistake. For example, the spine. The reason that you DNF'd on the spine is because you bought a top of the range Salomon Gore-Tex waterproof that turned out to not be waterproof.
Well, I mean that was one of the reasons. Yeah. So I had very expensive gear that breached extremely quickly in some heavy rain. In fact, I had 2 on.
But then the cynical ultra runners were saying, well, you should have stood under the shower first. And at the time, you probably thought, what a ridiculous thing to say. Why would I stand in the shower to test the top of the... But realistically, you should have stood under the shower and tested it, shouldn't you?
Yeah. I think it's worth saying that realistically, I shouldn't have started that particular race with a broken knee. But that's what ultimately slowed me down. But yeah, you're 100% right. Kit, that's a great example of kit testing. I had bought this particular gear, Salomon. I think the range was a Bonatti range or something like that, so they might correct me. Salomon might sue me. The range itself was supposed to be impregnable, just an amazing waterproof second skin, all this kind of crap. And I had a jacket and some bottoms, seams taped and all that kind of stuff. And I actually had a second one. I don't know if you knew this. I had a second jacket, a larger one that Chris had given me. His one, which mine was a medium, his was an extra large, and I could put it on top as a second layer. So I had 2 of them on, and we were in the rain. Myself and a chap called Alan Cormack. If Alan's watching, thank you for all your help, Alan. Alan saved me. We ran through. It was torrential rain. It was horrendous. You wouldn't have stood outside it for more than 30 seconds if you were outside for a fag outside the pub or whatever. You'd have left that one, But within 10 minutes, I was soaked. But because you're running, you're moving, you're hot, you're sweaty and all the rest of it, I wasn't really all that aware that I was soaked. So when we stopped for a moment, suddenly I was very, very cold and very, very wet and very, very exposed and very quickly, very, very hypothermic. And so my race was very, very fucked. So that was no fun. But actually, going back to what Fergus was saying, if I had tested that kit better, there's no point in me pointing the finger of scorn at Salomon, because if I'd just gotten in the shower or dived under a waterfall with that, I'd have known within seconds, this is not waterproof. I need to try again, rather than what is waterproof on Google. Salomon's a good range. They can't be wrong. So test your kit. It's so bloody obvious. Test it in the worst conditions that you may encounter, and you'll know that you're going to be good. And it's so obvious, and it's stuff that guys listening to this that would know of our backgrounds and the people that we work with would go, why would your kit not be top of the list, Johnny? And it was just a foolhardy mistake, really. It was a bit of ego relying on that big brand name. But that's just one example. You want to make sure that your backpack's comfortable. This is something that you went through with the extra weight. It was the weight as much as the pack, but if you've got a pack where the shoulder straps don't fit good, and don't fit nice on you, and you're running with any weight at all, which you will do in an ultramarathon, even just to carry water, if you're uncomfortable for 1, 2, 3 minutes, that's going to be magnified and magnified and magnified over hours, to the point at which it's going to be horrendous. So get as comfy as you can. Test the kits, test your shoes, test your socks, test what your blister repair routine is like, your blister prevention routine, test your waterproofs, all this kind of stuff. So everything from top to toe that you could use. And then again, go to your contingency in terms of plan for the worst case scenario, and then have a plan B so that you don't flap when you might need to divert to plan B. I think the bottom line is, be prepared.
You need to try. You need to turn up to the start line trusting in your training, trusting in the process, and trusting that you have contingency plans for anything that might go wrong. The first couple that you do, there might be things that go wrong that you hadn't planned for, but that's all part of learning. That's all part of the fun. but with enough obstacles crossed and covered and boxed off in training, it means that psychologically you might not take as much of a hit when things do start to go wrong. You're in a better state of mind to be able to calibrate a little bit and then move on. But that is ultimately why ultra running is so fantastic.
It's also ultimately why I sabotaged you, or attempted to sabotage your first 94 attempt. Or your
nice try, buddy. So yeah, I think that is the bottom line, is we have gained an awful lot from it. We have athletes that have gained an awful lot from it. We know a lot of people that have gained an awful lot from it that aren't affiliated with us or connected to us in any way whatsoever, but we are very, very much in the camp that you should sign up to an ultramarathon. So do it. Thank you very much. Anyway, that is today's podcast. Bit of an overarching summary of why ultramarathons are not great, but are also kind of great. Do make sure that you have followed or subscribed. And that's it, actually. And that you've shared this episode with a friend, please. And rated and reviewed if you're on Apple Podcasts, and if you're on Spotify, just a rating, as that would be fantastic, and it would make us both very, very happy. So thank you for listening to episode number 2, and we will see you next time for episode number 3.